So, here's some rough divisions. You've got your cerebellum. That cerebellum, we don't know what the hell that thing does. If you don't have one, you get all wobbly. But there's more neurons in the cerebellum than there are in the rest of the brain. So, like, is it just making you not wobbly? It seems like a tremendous devotion of resources to something that's relatively simple. So, alcohol, when you're a new drinker, alcohol is really hard on the cerebellum, which is why you're, you know, totally useless in a motorway and you fall down and all those things happen. But so that's the cerebellum, and we don't know what it does, even though it's very complexly branched. It kind of looks like a cauliflower, and it's just packed full of neurons. And then there's the occipital lobe, and that kind of use that to see with, more or less. And then the parietal lobe kind of helps you keep track of who you are from a bodily perspective, and sort of where your body's located in space, and sort of who you are as an embodied person. So, for example, if you lose the right parietal lobe because you have a stroke, then you lose the left side of your body, and even more weirdly, you lose the left side of everything. So all of a sudden you can't see the left side of anything. And no one can figure out what that's like, because say I'm looking at this room, and I have this parietal damage. If I'm looking at the room, do I not see the left side of the room? And then if I look at you, all of a sudden I don't see your left side. Like, we can't figure that out. Like, the left is gone, but then the left is relative to where you happen to be looking. Now, I think one of the ways of understanding it is sort of like, you know how you clearly can't see anything behind your head. And it's not black where you can't see, right? It's black if you close your eyes. But there's a difference between what you can't see behind your head and the black you see when you close your eyes, because the black sort of seems like nothing. But compared to what's behind your head, it's not nothing at all. So I think what happens with people who have neglect, parietal damage, is that like back part just goes like this. And so instead of, you know, you seeing this much of the world, and this being just not there at all as far as vision is concerned, it goes like this. And so then you've only got like a quarter of the world that you're, and so people like that, sometimes they'll throw their own legs out of bed. So they wake up and they think, oh my God, because they can kind of detect the left, but not very well, and they're quite freaked out because, you know, like, do you really want to wake up with a leg in bed with you? No, so they grab it and throw it out, and that's not so good because they're attached to it. Or so they'll eat, and they only eat half the food on their plate, but if you turn the plate, then they'll eat half of the half that's left. So anyways, that's the parietal lobe. Temporal lobe. That enables you to hear, roughly speaking. There's a lot of memory there too. And the frontal lobe, well, first of all, the frontal lobe seems to allow you to make voluntary movements, sort of at the highest level of abstraction. And then the prefrontal cortex, which would be right at the front of the yellow there, it's sort of like the back part of the frontal lobe enables you to make voluntary movements. But the prefrontal cortex enables you to represent the potential motor movements that you might make before you implement them. And so it evolved out of the motor strip during the course of evolution. It's sort of like, well, first you learned how to act voluntarily, and then as that grew, and it's particularly big in human beings, that part was able to divorce actions from your body, represent them in an abstract space, run them as simulations, calculate the outcome, and then implement them or not. And you know, it's a hit and miss business, because lots of you people undoubtedly simulate catastrophic outcomes and then go do whatever it is you were going to do anyways. Like, you know, that happens to people all the time, say when they're trying to stop drinking or to stop using cocaine or not to binge eat. Or so, you know, your prefrontal cortex can whip up these simulations, but other parts of your body can override them quite badly. So that's sort of roughly the brain, at least from, you know, looking at it from the side. And then this is it split down the middle. And you can see that it's not precisely two hemispheres all the way down. In the middle, it's one thing, and then it grows these two things like a little hat. And as far as I'm concerned, all the important parts of the brain are low down, central, old. You know, because people like to think that, well, if it evolved a long time ago, it's primitive. It's like, no. If it evolved a long time ago, it's been around a long time. It's really smart. That's why you don't run your liver. The autonomic nervous system runs it, because it's been around for an awful long time and it knows exactly how to do it. And so it's really, in some sense, the new parts of the brain in many ways are the parts that are primitive. So and the old parts are extremely necessary and sophisticated. And so the areas we're going to concentrate on most particularly are, well, the cortex we've already talked about. The cortex is probably responsible, people like to think of it as responsible for consciousness, and there's something about that that's right, but it's quite clear that human beings can remain conscious even if they have a substantial amount of damage to the cerebral cortex. So consciousness is a really weird thing. We're not very good at figuring out where it's localized at all. Cerebral cortex, thalamus. The thalamus is the place where all your sensory information comes together. So, you know, when you look at the world, it's kind of like a continuum of experience, despite the fact that you have these 5 different sensory inputs. And the thalamus seems to sort of unite all that, and then it sends the messages that it amalgamates up to the cortex, and the cortex sends them back, and the thalamus sends them back, and there's like this loop between the thalamus and the cortex, and maybe that's part of what consciousness is. You know, rather than being localized in an area, it could easily be a process. And you know, the fact that consciousness sort of turns on in the morning, which is a very weird thing, seems to indicate to me that it's probably something like that. It's a loop. It's the looping interaction between brain areas. And you know, if something's looping like that, it gets really weird properties. So that's a positive feedback system, you know. And I don't know if you've ever hooked a video camera to a TV and then turned the video camera on the TV. You know, it starts doing extremely weird things. You can get all sorts of unbelievably complex designs and weird phenomena because the TV is recycling its own signal, you know, so there's this circuit in there that's looping. And I suspect consciousness is something like that. The hippocampus is responsible for the movement of short-term information into long-term storage. It's a very important part of the brain. We'll talk about that more next time. The amygdala is responsible for a lot of emotional responses. And the hypothalamus is responsible for a lot of primordial motivational states. And so we'll stop, and we'll start with the hypothalamus on Tuesday. See you soon.